I'd like to start to say that I'm not a computer scientist, and I'm not an engineer, and I'm not a philosopher. I'm a psychologist that works with people and human systems and has very pragmatic concerns about how people change and how can people manage changing their world, and how can we manage our world and the complexity of our world. And this is important for the kind of things that I will be presenting, this kind of very pragmatic application. But the purpose of this talk is somehow to rehearse with you some ideas that I've been playing on practice and that I would like to extend somehow, and maybe some fantasies that I want to try to understand if they're possible, if they can come true, and maybe you can help me with that. So the focus is I will be building upon a new theoretical framework for complex thinking, or for the practice of complex thinking, and I'll talk about this in a minute, to discuss new possibilities of its application in terms of the design of human or computer-guided tools and strategies that can be supported by what I will call other cognitive systems or other intelligences, which when coupled with a target observer or my intelligence of interest would support and augment the enactment of complex thinking in the coupling with a target system of interest in relation to which I want to enact some type of change. And through that, build what I will call a system of co-augmented intelligences that might lead to more complex outcomes and open up more effective possibilities for action in the world. So I'll try to unpack this during my presentation. And the intention is really to open just a space of dialogue, of collaboration, and try to understand what are the challenges, the theoretical, the methodological, the pragmatical, but maybe also the ethical challenges of conceptualizing, designing, and implementing computational tools and strategies that could support the construction of these systems of co-augmented or co-augmenting intelligences and scaffold the complexity of our thinking, and above all to think in terms of their morphological constraints and possibilities. So why am I talking about this, and why is this relevant? And in short, is because we are messed up and the world is in a mess, and we need to manage this mess. And we understand that the world is complex and we need to manage this complexity. And clearly our modes of thinking have not been complex enough. So the question is, how do we build modes of thinking that are congruent enough with the complexity of the world so that our actions might be more effective, more sustainable, and more positive from the perspective of a variety of observers, not just human, but others on Earth. And also, we know that interdisciplinarity has been called upon to respond to some of these challenges, but it needs to be creative enough to, and abductive enough to make a difference. And so it also needs to be complex enough. And in this mess, we have practitioners, policymakers, and managers that have to make decisions. They have to conduct interventions in conditions of high uncertainty and imperfect or partial information, and sometimes very high risks. So how do they manage their actions? How do they deal with this complexity? And how do they come about to making decisions? So this is really the focus of my work. So what I'm saying is that in managing the complexity of the world, the relative complexity of the observer or the intervener matters. We can't be as complex as the world as we're trying to affect and we're trying to manage. So to some extent, our complexity can be augmented indirectly or directly by the complexity of our coupling with our target systems of interest. And this is the basic postulate, is that we're not complex enough, but maybe we can build complex enough relationships with other systems that would lead to some type of emergent outcomes whose effects might guide our actions. So because we build some degree of coherence, we might be guided into acting in ways that will be positive for all the interveners in that system, if you want, even if we don't fully understand it, when we're not fully capable of mapping that system. But the fact is that in managing or in building that complexity of the coupling, our own contributions matter. So the question is, how do we manage ourselves in that coupling with the target system of interest to build the necessary or the requisite complexity? And this brings us to this proposal of complex thinking, which I won't have time to detail, but that pretty much building on the work of Edgar Morin, we're building a framework for the practice of complex thinking that is defined really as a mode of coupling with the world. And I will be explaining a little bit more about this. And I won't have time to explain the epistemological foundations of this, but the framework is clearly grounded in a relational worldview and an active view of cognition. Okay? And cognition as embodied, embedded, extended, situated, and bringing forth particular micro worlds and particular possibilities for action. So complex thinking is defined in this framework as a coupling process that on the one hand is capable of attending or recognizing the features of the complexity of the world as complexity sciences have somehow uncovered them. But simultaneously, it enacts at the level of its own organization the same type of properties that we recognize in complex systems. And in doing that, it is more likely to result in complex outcomes. It is more likely to produce sufficiently differentiated perspectives and visions and a variety of information to guide actions. It is capable of leading to emergence at a level of our thinking in terms of new hypotheses, new explanations, new information. It is capable of generating a variety of pragmatically useful possibilities for action and somehow making contributions to this increased coherence with our target systems of interest. So what the framework does is that it defines a certain number of properties that we would see in complex systems and try to understand to what they correspond to at the level of our thinking. And I won't have time to detail these properties, but I'll talk to you about some tools that try to work with some of these properties, namely, how do we increase the structural complexity of our thinking, the variety, the multidimensionality, the amount of things that we're capable of thinking of, and the nature of the information that we work. How do we make it organized in a relational way? How do we make it integrated enough so that every bit of information is capable of interacting and changing in the relationship with the other? How do we build a recursive organization? How do we play with timescales at the level of our thinking? How do we work with path dependency and with our own historical constraints? And how do we are able to change and understand what were the points of bifurcation? How do we manage the relationship between parts and the wholes and the things that emerge? And how do we reintegrate them? So what we've been trying to do is to find strategies and tools that allow us to enact each one of these properties when we try to understand or couple with a target system of interest. So the framework kind of like says that the combination, each one of these properties somehow will bring forth a dimension of the world and particular possibilities for action. But above all, that their interaction under particular conditions that I won't have time to detail might lead us to some sort of abductive leaps, might lead to the generation of information that was not there before at the level of the pieces of information that we used to think. That's clearly emergence, that's abductive, but that will guide actions that will generate even more information, hopefully that will lead to coherent results. So what we've been trying to do is play with some analogical tools that allow us to understand, look at the system of interest and play with the information that we generate in that coupling. And we've been working with tools such as this that if we have time in the discussion, I can play a bit with it and show you a bit how we do this, but that we could play with these tools and allow us to, for example, work with the structural variety of information, to adding depth, to adding perspectives, but also to clearly and physically manipulate the information. And look at my hands, because I'm thinking with my hands right now. I'm clearly manipulating the information, building different types of relations, integrating them, generating new wholes, okay? So our thinking is thinking in action, is thinking in movement, has the work of Barbara Tversky, for example, as shown well. And we're trying to play with these properties. We're trying to manipulate the information somehow with our bodies. And as I will be saying, somehow managing the relationship between the landscapes of being, of the more intuitive, fast, pre-reflective type of knowing, and the more abstract type of information too. So these are just examples of tools that I've been using. For example, this is a digital relatoscope that's used for facilitating scientific meetings. You can see different ideas being related and integrated. And these tools up here represent observatrons, tools that allow us to experiment different perspectives. So it's really about how do we manage ourselves in relation to the information that we generate too? And how do we let that information change us so that we can further improve the complexity of our coupling? So these are more examples. But notice how this information is not just symbolic. For example, this is an example on an observatron that incorporates images, that incorporates ideas that have been worked out in a much more embodied way through metaphors, through physical constructions, through works with Play-Dohs, through images. And they've allowed us to stretch, if you want, to the symbolic ideas or the abstract ideas in different ways and find new variations. And then we come and we relate them and we integrate them with these relational movements in the relatoscope. So what I propose in this talk is to bring a bit further this notion of complex thinking beyond the mere practice of these different individual properties of coupling or properties of complex thinking, to conceptualize it as a sort of meta-conversational emergent pattern or a star cybernetic, where, and it corresponds to a sort of complex process of knowing, which being dependent on actions and enacting a set of properties of complex systems, intentionally explores and manipulates the dynamic relationship between two landscapes of human cognition, the landscape of being or know-how, of direct knowing, a fast, pre-reflexive, embodied, fast, system one type, automated type of thinking, and the landscape of symbolic meaning, abstracted constructions that could be more in the form of narratives, propositions, discourses, laws, but a slow system type 2 type of thinking. So complex thinking will, on the one hand, enact those individual properties, and on the other hand, allow for each bit of information, if you want, to be explored simultaneously in these two landscapes and for them to work out so they can perturb each other. And in doing that, this meta-conversational pattern will lead to emergent outcomes. Normally, it will perform complexity of the level of the thinking in terms of abductive thinking, namely creative abduction, probably a more type of model-based visual and manipulative abduction, but other forms of abduction too. So our proposal is that to engage with complex situations, an observer needs to be able to manage their complexity, but that their complexity might need to be scaffolded somehow. So they need to manage, on the one hand, the coupling with the target system of interest here, enacting these different properties of complex system, but then they need to manage themselves, and the information that generated this coupling perturbs the landscapes of being and the landscapes of knowing, and manipulating the relationship in a way that leads to novel information that might result in variations, innovations, or even deeper transformations in both of these landscapes, both the landscape of experiencing and the landscape of making sense of or abstracting. So if we're not complex enough, sometimes we need to scaffold our own complexity. And the proposal is that we might couple different types of intelligences and build these systems or co-augmented intelligences through the practice of complex thinking. And I have a target intelligent of interest, and I'll have a coupled intelligence to it. And this could be a human-to-human interaction, but it could be a human-to-human computationally supported interaction, or it could be a human-to-AI types of interaction. And the challenge is, what kind of tools do we build that allow us then to manipulate these landscapes of being and this landscape of knowing with the information that we generate? So how do we bring this, and how do I have a tool that helps me play with the variety of information, that elicits different types of experiences, that makes me experiment different positions, that helps me with physically manipulating the information and finding new patterns? And what are the requirements for these tools to actually work and to actually augment our intelligences? So on the one hand, this other intelligence, which I said could be an AI or could be another human system, needs to stir the practice of these complex properties. On the other hand, they need to guide and explore the information of key information in both of these landscapes and support their integration. And they need to support the rehearsal of these thinking movements or actions or thinking choreographies in moving the information in space somehow. But they also need to be organized according themselves to principles of complex thinking, and they need to be coupled in a way that both of their landscapes of being and their landscapes of knowing interact with each other. So the questions are also, what are the morphological constraints, in the way that these different intelligences are going to interact? What are the minimal and optimal requirements for the information to be able to circulate between these two intelligent systems and to lead to perturbations? For example, if we need a tight coupling between this other intelligent system with myself, do I require a separate and a mediated physical body for this other intelligence to operate, or could it operate on me? Could this other artificial system, for example, operate through me and I become the embodied dimension of it, yet it guides my actions and allows me to build different types of experiences and abstract different types of information as I manipulate the information? Could the human body be physically prompted or supported by this other intelligent system to engage in particular types of sensory motor actions that allows us to explore these new experiences, both in the landscape of being and the landscape of knowing? Could they support the integration of information and their intentional manipulation, for example, through sensory stimulation, through imagery, to prompting, like I said, imagery or the physical manipulation of information? So what kind of form of materiality does this AI have to build so that we can have enough variety, but not excessive novelty, or it'll disintegrate the original intelligence? So how can I have enough variety in manipulating abstract information, but also sensing and moving and experiencing ourselves even in relation to that information? And you might recognize some images here from some movies, but how do we play with this information? How do we create an interface that allows me to have new experiences also in this information? But the question is also, to what extent the feedback from this other intelligence system, actually from my target system to another OI, can augment this other intelligence. So if this other intelligence system, like an artificial intelligence, is sufficiently and tightly coupled with me through some sort of physical medium too, and this feedback needs to take place also in their landscape of being, and what is their landscape of being? And to what extent can we increase their complexity through their own coupling with us? So they're augmenting our own intelligence, but maybe we will be augmenting their own intelligence too. And does this physical dimension of this other OI needs to be reconfigurable, for example, to be continuously reconstructed and transformed as a function of the creative exploration of these landscapes of knowing? Do they need to sense us? Do they need to couple with our embodied movements? Or do they just need to receive the abstract information that we create through our own embodied movements? And could this open enough space for variation of innovation, like I said, in the transformation of both of these? So the question is, does the practice of some sort of coupled complex thinking augment the capabilities of our target observer of interest, but also of this supporting intelligence, which could be another human or an AI? And so it raises issues about the nature of the socially and the spatially distributed nature of cognition, but also of the nature of the designs and the morphology of the interfaces that might support their coevolution. So we don't only have augmented human intelligence, but maybe systems of co-augmented intelligence. So how could this be possible? What are the more viable possibilities? What are the more distant ways? What pathways could be explored? These are my questions for further interdisciplinary debates, but these are my ambitions somehow, because we need to make decisions and act in complex ways. Oh, thank you.